Good morning, good afternoon, welcome. Today is Wednesday, March 10th. Really excited for today's session. Today we are going to hear from Dr. Audrey Giles from the University of Ottawa. She is a research in the Human Kinetics School, and she has been doing research with Indigenous and subarctic communities for the last 20 years. I first heard Dr. Giles at the Alberta Recreation and Parks Association conference out here in Alberta. I believe it was in Lake Louise outside of Banff in October of 2013. So I had only been in Alberta for a few months, and this was my first professional development social event. And I remember going to this conference and being so amazed by the conference and the amenities and the speakers. This was the first time that I, as an aquatic professional, had been invited to a conference. I didn't have those types of opportunities back when I was in Ontario working in facilities. So to make a long story short, Dr. Giles' session back in 2013 on her research at the time was just so eye-opening for me that when I started working on the 2021 POOLaide webinars, when I started thinking about who are people that I would like to ask to speak, deep in the recesses of my brain, it didn't come up right away, but I did remember Dr. Giles' research. Specifically, what I remembered that really grabbed me was I was living in Northern Alberta at the time. We had a lot of First Nations, Métis communities and settlements. And that was new for me, having come from urban areas in Ontario, such as Ottawa and Toronto. And so I really appreciated her perspective, grounded in research about swimming experiences, water safety experiences, boating experiences of these communities and how they translate or do not to our existing swimming lesson curriculums. So I've been a swimming instructor for 18 years. I've taught boating safety more times than I could count. And I would probably consider myself reasonably qualified based on my own experience working on a lake, at a summer camp, teaching sailing, teaching windsurfing, teaching kayaking. I thought I had this covered, right, as a swim instructor. And to hear Dr. Giles talk about how boats are used for trapping and hunting, not just in summer, but all seasons, right up until the winter freeze. To talk about water safety as, perhaps the individual is making a prayer to the gods. Perhaps as equipment, they're bringing a handgun to shoot animals or predators. To understand that life jackets might be associated with concepts of whiteness and white bias and negative experiences with colonialism or colonization was just so obvious to me after she said it, but such a limitation of my understanding of what I had been doing for years and years. So don't want to give away all the secret sauce in advance, but super excited for Dr. Giles today. I think she's going to be a great speaker. I know she's going to be a great speaker. She's done the research. This is a new method for her, so she does teach online, but I don't think she's addressed a pool community in this way recently. So excited to hear what she's been working on. She continues to receive grants and opportunities to publish her work. So it's very well received, very well respected, very easy to Google. I've put some articles on the show notes page for today. I will pop that in the chat box. But it is going to depend on each person's comfort level, whether they would like to download academic articles or whether they're looking for the more accessible sound bites that the general media has republished. So that's a little bit of what is happening today. Good morning. Those of you just coming in, welcome. My name is Katie Crysdale. We'll be starting in about 11 minutes whenever our presenter gets here. We will be starting pretty much on time today once she arrives, as she's quite in demand with her schedule, and I don't know how many questions she'll be able to take today, but I'm really excited for her session. You can see the PowerPoint slides already uploaded on the show notes. So if you go to lakeviewaquaticconsultants.com, click on the menu that says POOLaide, you can drop down to the year 2021, and then find today's session, which is Wednesday, March 10th. And the title of today's session is going to be Considerations for Aquatics Programs and Initiatives with Indigenous Communities. So that here in Canada is going to be our First Nations communities, our Métis settlements, and depending on where people are based in Canada, they will have either direct application, somewhere like Manitoba, Northern Ontario has a strong, large First Nations population. Where I am currently in Southern Alberta, not quite as much as when I lived in Northern Alberta, but still really relevant information for any aquatics professional to understand the biases that come from our existing swimming lesson curriculums, our water safety, how do we teach it? Is it from a bias of privilege or urban bias, or what does that look like? Coming up this Friday, March 12th, we have another session that I'm really excited about. And I know I say that every time, but it is a session that was at the top of my list when I started designing the 2021 webinars, and that was to meet the needs of seniors. So seniors is a somewhat limited focus. So our presenters on Friday, who are occupational therapists, they do work with senior citizens in a senior citizens residence, but they're going to be taking a step back and looking at a broader perspective of how we can make recreation more person-focused and person-directed. We, as programmers, schedulers, swimming instructors, managers, we have a tendency to have our own very specific lens of what we want to apply to a swimming pool as the most efficient way to use it and program it. So I'm very excited for them to talk about how their perspective of people's abilities is really going to inform what we program and what we do in the pool. And then coming up on Monday, we have more of a pool operations mechanical perspective, but one that I think is very valuable. So the title of the session on Monday, March 15th is going to be Project Gaps, Who's Responsible for What? So let me pop that in the chat box as well. The person presenting on Monday is a longtime colleague of mine, Jamie Lopes. He is from Waterloo, Ontario, so southwest of Toronto. He works for Aquatic Engineering and Design, and he is exclusively a pool engineer in Canada. So what that means is he literally draws up the blueprints, the construction plans to tender swimming pools. He doesn't do the conceptual visual design. He literally says, this is where the pipes run, these are how big they are, this is where the hose bib is located, this is how bright the lights should be, and he works on scoping the project. He is also a certified pool operator instructor, just like me, and I have invited him to talk about project gaps. He and I have been working with a number of clients in the last year, consulting projects where I'm perhaps the consultant for the client, he's the engineer for the client. We're working together to ensure the client gets what they want. And there's often gaps in what the client expects, gaps in what the client gets, gaps in what the builders build. And so we're really hoping that he can identify on Monday in a very digestible way who is responsible for what in different projects. And so that is from a big scope overview level of, you know, if this is an area that you're working on, let's say plumbing, or let's say you're working on ventilation, this is the person who's working on it. Or if it's not this person, somebody else needs to work on it. So it's going to be a very high level general introduction to what's going on if you're ever involved in presentations. Hello, good morning.
Hello.
So we'll just wait 1 or 2 minutes until the hour, if that's okay for you. You
Sure.
can mute yourself, and then I will, at the hour, I'll give an introduction, we'll pull up your slides, I'll let everyone know what's happening, and then I'll disappear so that your screen is bigger with the PowerPoint.
Sounds great.
Wonderful. So good morning, those of you who are joining us so far. We'll be starting right on the hour this morning, Dr. Giles' schedule. We'll be pulling up that PowerPoint and getting going. So thanks to you, those of you who are on time this morning. I know that sometimes it can be difficult to wrangle the time to get off the pool deck and get in front of the computer. I know today's session is going to be very, very valuable for you. It certainly was for me. I first heard some of Dr. Giles' research out here in Alberta back in 2013, and it was really a great perspective for me to be informed. I was coming from growing up in Ontario, working in Ontario, grew up in Ottawa, went to the University of Toronto, worked in large urban areas. And although in Toronto, I was accustomed to a very diverse population in downtown Toronto, we served a variety of clients. I didn't realize how out of my depth I was until I moved to work at a remote community in northern Alberta. And it was a town of 2,500 people, 2.5 hours from Edmonton, a lot of First Nations communities, Métis settlements. We were actually in 2 different territories, 2 different agreements. And it's interesting how little I understood as a water safety professional for 18 years as a swimming instructor, how limited my focus was. And so that was really, really great for me in 2013 to have that perspective. And I know many of you are going to get that perspective today, hearing Dr. Giles' research and really probing. It's going to cause a lot of questions for many of you, whether you're in Canada or the US, what that looks like in terms of applying that at your aquatic facility. So we'll be starting shortly. I'll start with an introduction of Dr. Giles and then let her get going with the PowerPoint. I'll be talking in the after show. We'll take a couple short questions. If there are any, I'll keep an eye on the chat box during the session. And then after Dr. Giles leaves, I'll be talking about our sessions coming up on Friday and then early next week. So thanks everyone for being here. Today it is Wednesday, March 10th, 2021. I am Katie Crysdale, and thank you for joining us today for a webinar. I would like to introduce today's presenter. You can find all of the information directly in the link I've pinned in the chat box, so POOLaide 21-10. So today's session is entitled Considerations for Aquatics Programs and Initiatives with Indigenous Communities. We've got Dr. Audrey Giles. She is a full professor in the School of Human Kinetics at the University of Ottawa. In 2018, she held a Fulbright Arctic Research Chair at Dartmouth College. For 15 years, she has conducted research on water and boating safety with Indigenous communities, primarily in the Arctic and subarctic. She has received over $1.5 million in funding and has published over 100 peer-reviewed articles. So I'm going to pass it over to Dr. Giles. I'm going to pull up her presentation, let her get going with her camera and her microphone. As always, you guys know I will be in the chat box, so I'm not going to be on screen. I'll be here present to troubleshoot if anything comes up. But let's give it welcome to Dr. Giles in the chat box, a hello, wherever you're located. It's nice for her to get some feedback that way because she doesn't know your names and faces the way I do.
All right. Well, hello, everybody, and thanks so much for having me. And thank you, Katie, for being, just an incredibly organized organizer. You've made it very, very easy. So I see Dawn is in Corvallis, Oregon. If I am right, I think that's Oregon State University land. Oh, Queen's University. That's where I did my undergrad. Fantastic. Maryland. It's the Beavers. That's it. I had an ex-partner who was a passionate Oregon State Beavers fan. Beaumont, Alberta. All right. That's actually my first dog was from Beaumont, Alberta. So I did graduate school at the University of Alberta. So Tundra the Border Collie was a fantastic dog. And Toronto, my place of birth. Yes, go Beavs. He was the easiest person to buy for, my ex, because it was just like Beavers everything. And Edmonton, so where I did my graduate degree. Fantastic. So as Katie said, I'm a professor in the School of Human Kinetics at the University of Ottawa. And I became interested in aquatics, as a child. I mean, all of you are fellow aquatics geeks, I assume. And I was a swimming instructor and a lifeguard. And I, worked in that area for many years. After my first year of undergrad, I went to the Arctic to run a swimming pool. And that was a summer job, and it really changed my life. And I ended up working or volunteering at pools throughout graduate school and throughout my field work in the Northwest Territories. And I had no interest really or idea that I could do research in aquatics, except after I finished grad school, which was like very kind of anthropological work looking at Indigenous women's involvement in Dene games in the Northwest Territories. I needed a new idea, and I said, you know, I should go back to my roots, which is as a pool person, and really take a look at why I struggled so much with the programs that I gave in the North. So I definitely, you know, have a very strong pool background. I remain passionate about safety, and you know, it's turned into kind of, you know, about half my research focuses on this area. So I want to start off by saying that I am a non-Indigenous person, so I'm a settler, and certainly I don't try to speak on behalf of Indigenous peoples, but I think that my research really can be useful in telling some of their stories to communities that would like to hear them. So we'll get going here. So my objectives today are kind of to use the micro to illustrate the macro. A lot of what I do in my work is looking at how there are cultural considerations that we tend not to take in certain environments, and that ends up perpetuating racism. So I want to look at the ways in which there are some embedded ideas of culture within swimming pools. And in particular, I want to look at the intersections of gender, culture, colonialism, and injury, and to represent taken for granted assumptions. I think we all have assumptions about why drownings happen and some of the causes, but I want to dig a bit deeper into them. And a favorite quote that I have is from a man, Zebedee Nungack, and he is an Inuit activist. And he said, "We're here to do constructive damage to the status quo." And I love this quote. I have this up on my office door. As social scientists, we're often accused of finding problems and not solutions. And certainly that has been the case with work with Indigenous communities. It's been highly stigmatizing and really looked at taking a deficit-based approach. So I am trying to take to problematize that, to look at the systemic issues and institutional issues that create the situations that we often want to avoid. So I want to just shout out to folks from Minneapolis, Chicago, Central Cali, and Charlottesville. All great locations that I would love. Some of them I haven't visited, and I would love to in the after COVID finally ends. Okay, so some qualifiers. Now, in 1999, one Canadian territory was was broken up into two. And I'll show you a map in just a second. So the Northwest Territories used to, let's say, be an area this big, and then they created Nunavut, which took a chunk out of the Northwest Territories. And Nunavut is an Inuit homeland. But that division happened in 1999, but some data are still collected as though they're together, because otherwise it would be too easy to identify people in using coroner data. So sometimes it's impossible to just speak about what's going on in Nunavut or what's just going on in the Northwest Territories. They're considered together, or sometimes all three territories are considered together. Indigenous identifiers. So within the data, with coroner's reports in Canada, we don't record ethnicity. And so when they look at trying to figure out how many Indigenous people have drowned, they look at the person's last name and where they drowned, which is a really terrible proxy because it makes a lot of assumptions that are deeply problematic. So we have to take all of these data with a grain of salt. Immersion deaths, drowning deaths, hypothermia deaths are all kind of collapsed together and considered as the same thing. And then finally, epidemiology takes sex to be a binary. So saying, there's man and woman, and we know that a lot of people don't identify that way. But again, coroner's reports are still not capturing those data. So these are just some qualifiers that I'd like to throw out there. So here we have a map of Canada. Most of the research that I will be talking about is in the Northwest Territory. So kind of the top left-hand corner, the pink part, and some of it is from Nunavut as well. So that's where I've done the majority of my research, but I have worked in lots of other places and done work in other places like Northern Alberta, for instance. So immersion fatalities. If we look at immersion fatalities in Canada, this is from the Canadian Red Cross's 20-year report. And so this was a big undertaking that they took to kind of look at trends across time. And what we can see, and nobody in water safety will be surprised to see this though, is that men drown at a rate much higher than women. But what I find really interesting is looking at kind of where the peaks are. So we have from about age 15 to age 54 is where we really see this big uptick. But if we think about the programming that we give at pools or waterfronts, we tend to focus on kids. So kind of this, under 1 year of age to 14. Yet it seems as though at around age 14, something changes. Yet we don't do a ton of education programs at pools that target this older group. So I want us to really think about that and to think about how we tend to assume that the behaviors we teach children will track into adulthood, when clearly this shows that this is in fact not the case. Yet we have very few interventions kind of aimed at adults, particularly at swimming pools, apart from, kind of learn to swim programs. When, I think these data show that, learning how to swim is not necessarily the problem. I think there's something else going on here. I mean, women are pretty consistent across the bottom, so there doesn't seem to be the same thing that happens. So we're giving men and women the same programs, yet we're having different outcomes. And this is a theme that I want to keep coming back to, is how despite giving the same program to people, different people take up the same program in different ways, and these can have deadly consequences. So these are statistics on recreational boating and immersion deaths. I've been doing a lot of work on boating in recent years. Now, if I were to give you, so these are different regions of Canada. So if the territories collapse together, Ontario, the prairies, BC, etc. Now, if I were to give you $1 million and said, do something about recreational boating deaths, where would you spend this money? Maybe you can just put it in the chat. Which region would you give $1 million to based on these data? It says Ontario. Okay, so Sarah says Ontario. So absolutely, that's what this shows, right? So there's 31% of these boating related immersion deaths happen in Ontario. That's 760. But here's the problem with these data. Ontario has by far the greatest population in Canada, followed by Quebec and British Columbia. So what we need to do is look at these data by population. So in the next slide, if we look at this and if we measure by 100,000 people, we can see that the Canadian average is 0.6 per 100,000, but the Northwest Territories is 16 times higher, Nunavut is 6 times higher, and Yukon is 11 times higher. So let's just go back to that previous slide here. The territories only account for 5% of deaths, but when we break it down by population, we can see that there's an enormous problem. And so this is the battle that I've been having with various drowning prevention organizations for many years, is that I don't believe we're putting the money where it is most needed. When I advocate for programs for the North, I'm often told that the population is too small. So if you combine all 3 territories, you're looking at about 160,000 people. And certainly the population is small. And I'm also told, okay, the population is too small to have special programs. But the programs are clearly not working in the North. So I think that it's pretty clear by looking at these data, when we do it by measured by 100,000, that there is a huge problem. So some more statistics from the Canadian Red Cross's 20-year report. So as we saw, 15 to 74-year-olds account for 94% of recreational boating immersion deaths. 93% were male, but children under 15 years of age were only 3% of deaths. So again, I think certainly these data are about boating, but I think it raises some questions about where we put resources, because we tend to, again, assume that behavior is going to track from what we teach kids about boating safety in, their Red Cross or Life Saving Society or YMCA swimming lessons, and take it into real life, into the rest of their lives. But that's not the case. So we have this group of adult men who are particularly vulnerable, yet are largely ignored. Now, Indigenous people, so in Canadian constitutional terms, Aboriginal is the correct term, though Indigenous is the preferred term these days. So basically, I use the term that the data were generated with. So Aboriginal peoples in Canada are about 4% of the Canadian population, but they are about 15% of immersion victims. Again, the data are not great, so we're not entirely sure. I think that would be an underrepresentation, possibly. So I always joke that I'm a qualitative researcher, but for people who like statistics, I think we have a pretty clear formula that men, and particularly Indigenous men, plus the North, plus boating safety equals risk. So what are the circumstances in which people are drowning? So here, this is for Indigenous people. We can see that daily living is 39%, right? And these are statistics that we don't tend to see with non-Indigenous people. For Indigenous people, particularly those who live outside of urban areas, being on the water is a way of life. It's a form of transportation. It's a way of getting around. It's a way of getting to hunting or angling sites. So there's a question there, is hunting daily or occupational? I would assume that that is under daily living. There are people who would be commercial fishers as well, but that would be a pretty small group. So daily life, as we can see, kind of has some inherent risks. And of course, I think it's not unusual to think that Indigenous people would be overrepresented in boating-related fatalities because they spend so much time, especially in rural and remote communities, on the water. So we have an exposure issue, right? If you don't drive, you're less likely to be killed driving a car. If you don't boat, you're of course less likely to be killed in a boat. So we definitely have to account for the fact that people who live in these communities are engaging in these activities more. So perhaps we're not going to see data that are super similar as a goal, but certainly I think that the huge disproportionate number of deaths in Indigenous communities, particularly in the North, is something that we need to attend to. So why is this happening? If I were to ask you why, boating-related fatalities or drownings in the North were happening, I think proximity to water is a big one. So most Indigenous communities are on bodies of water. And also many Indigenous communities are rural or remote, so they are far from help. My twin sister is a rural and remote family and emergency doctor. And in urban settings, we talk about the golden hour of getting people to help. And in the North, they kind of joke about it being a golden day, right? You need to make sure the medevac plane can get to you, that it's not picking someone else up, that the weather conditions are good, and that it can land. And all of these things take time. Water temperature is, of course, a factor as well. So if you're going to fall into really cold water, we know that there's chances of dying from hypothermia, and that's going to happen faster than if you were in warmer water. Failure to wear a life jacket, absolutely, this is a factor too. Access to swimming lessons. Now, I found this in the research, but I'm going to talk to you about it in a second, but access to swimming lessons isn't as big a problem in the Arctic as you might think. And then low income. So if you have a low income, you might be, for instance, unable to afford to maintain your boat, to buy life jackets. Now, the Northwest Territories Aquatics program started in the 1960s. And its goal was it was not actually about drowning prevention, which is fascinating. The initial goal of the program was to teach Indigenous peoples how to be good leaders, because apparently people who had survived in harsh conditions since time immemorial were incapable of being good leaders. So we can see some really deeply racist undertones to how this program began. And eventually the program kind of pivoted to also be interested in decreasing drowning water-related fatalities. So I want to dig a bit deeper into the history of this program. So here's one of my favorite pictures. This is Corky the barge, and this is actually a barge that has a swimming pool on board. So the right-hand side, that's a change room. The left-hand side, that is the swimming pool. And it is on the Mackenzie River, which is the largest or longest river in Canada. And it would go up the Mackenzie and stop in Indigenous communities along the way. So this picture was taken in 1970. So kids would get on board, take some swimming lessons, and get off. And so this was just one of the very innovative approaches to trying to teach swimming lessons in the North. I'm just switching slides here. So here are some pictures of facilities in the north. So in the bottom left-hand corner, this is the Sir John Franklin Pool, which was the first pool that was in the Northwest Territories. So this was in the capital, Yellowknife. And you can kind of, so both black and white pictures are from there. And that's what a lot of the original pools looked like. They were built seasonally because it was so cold, and you can't really dig into permafrost very easily. So they were mostly above ground pools that were about 3 feet deep and maybe 13 meters long, as I'm mixing metric and imperial, which is probably not helpful for people. But you can see in the top right-hand corner an example of what that pool would look like. In the top left-hand corner, the Fort Simpson swimming pool, I used to run that pool, so I know it well. But again, these pools are mostly waist deep. The picture that says keep the beach clean, that was taken at the beginning of June in a community called Trout Lake, where they actually have a very short waterfront program. So at its height, this program had swimming lessons in pools and also waterfronts in 41 northern communities. So it's actually been a very widespread program and one of the most popular, if not the most popular, recreation program in the north. So there were definitely swimming lessons that have been offered. So I've done a lot of research over the last 15, 16 years that has looked at drowning in the north. And I've been very lucky to be supported by the Social Sciences Humanities Research Council of Canada, Transport Canada, Health Canada, and Public Safety Canada. Those years, I should have changed those years. It's not 2015, it's 2021. So I mostly do community-based participatory action research, which means that I don't work on communities or study communities, I work with them. And they act as partners, and then I usually have local organizations as partners too. So you can see that over the years, I've done research with quite a few communities. Right now, I'm doing a program with Inuvialuit communities, which are basically the northernmost communities in the Northwest Territories, so the high Arctic, looking at kind of adaptations to boating safety programs with these communities. But my students and I have spent over 30 months in communities doing research. We've done probably close to 200 interviews now. We've collected oral histories, we've done focus groups, we've done participant observation by standing at boat ramps or on decks and swimming pools. We've done archival research, so getting pictures like Corky, and we've also done policy analysis. So this has been something that I've been really immersed in, if you'll excuse the water-related pun, for a number of years. So I really like to start with this picture here. So it says, the swimming pool will be closed today because of a bear in the area. Please do not wait by the pool fence today. So this picture was taken by one of my students who was spending the summer doing research, but also running the pool in Tuktoyaktuk, Northwest Territories. So in Tuktoyaktuk, basically they have a kind of like a sprung canvas form with an above ground pool in it, and it is surrounded by a fence. And the kids would line up along the fence. And in the south, that's not a big deal, but in the north, you're basically making a grizzly bear or a polar bear buffet. So when there's a bear in the area, the ways in which you have to think about safety are quite different. And certainly, in all of my years of working at pools in Toronto, my birthplace, I never had to put up a sign like this. So my point about the sign is that the context is different. Yet programs that we teach assume that everything is the same. And I think that that is part of the problem. So some of the results of my research. So water safety marginalizes traditional knowledge and northern expertise. So when I was doing research in Nunavut and asking people, how do you stay safe while boating? Numerous people told me you have to have a knife with you. So in the chat box, can anybody come up with an idea of why you'd want a knife with you for boating safety? Cutting rope? Yeah, that's what I thought, right? So, you're tangled, you're pulling your nets, maybe you got caught in your nets. No. You want to have the knife with you so that when you fall out of the boat, you can stab a piece of ice and pull yourself out. So much like you have ice picks, people will have them with them when they're snowmobiling, you basically need that. And again, when we think about water in the south, we don't think about it as having chunks of ice floating around. But in the north, even in the summertime, you'll have chunks of ice. So this was a really, important safety device. But, as someone from the South who went up to Nunavut to run a swimming pool in, my 20-year-old glory, I knew none of this. Yet it was assumed that because I had qualifications from Southern Canada, I was the person who should be teaching these programs. Yet local people who didn't have, traditional swimming qualifications, but knew how to actually stay safe on the Arctic Ocean, had no place at the pool. So there's a lot of traditional knowledge and Northern expertise that gets ignored when people from non-Indigenous communities come into Indigenous communities and are presented as the experts. Cross-cultural risk communication is something that's really important. Again, when I think back to the idea of, my 20-year-old self going to an Arctic community and being, presented as the expert on water safety, I think, why would anybody have listened to me, right? I didn't have the trust of the community. I didn't speak the language of the community, and I had no experience with keeping people safe on Arctic waters. So cross-cultural risk communication is really important to look at. And one of my favorite studies ever was done on the Yukon River in Alaska. So there was a community, and I didn't do the study, sadly, someone else did. There was a community where there were many drownings each year. The community was on a river, and people were crossing the river a lot for hunting, angling, etc. And in this community, as with many Indigenous communities, burial is exceptionally important. So if somebody went missing on the water, everything stopped, businesses would shut down, etc., and everyone would be looking for the person or, sadly, the body. So the researchers went to a group of elders and they said, we want you to come up with a strategy for how we can decrease drowning. So the elders said a few things. One, they said, okay, we want you to sell float coats. So, basically the top half of a survival suit at the local store at cost, but just sell them as like a cool fall jacket. You don't need to label them as being like a safety device. Then the other thing they said was, we have a message that we'd like you to put out there. And the message was this: wear your float coat, so if you drown, we won't have to drag the river for your body. Okay, so I would never come up with a message like that. It's pretty dark. But what that message had to its advantage is, one, it came from elders who were trusted. Two, it spoke to the cultural idea of the importance of finding bodies. Everybody knew how important it was to find bodies, and that people was taking days or weeks out of people's lives to try to find them. And this was incredibly successful. It decreased drowning by 50% and decreased the cost of search and rescue efforts by, I think it was almost $2 million in a year. So that really goes to show, the importance of cross-cultural communication. I think another really great example of kind of both one and two from this slide is what happened when I was working in Fort Simpson. So I showed you a picture of the swimming pool. So the swimming pool had some facility problems, shall we say kindly, and we weren't able to work at it for about the first 6 weeks that I was in the community with my coworker. So it was May, so we went into the schools to do water safety, boat safety, ice safety education. And so I had Transport Canada's pre-departure checklist with me, which lists all of the things that you should take with you on a boat trip or things that you should do before you leave. And so it was a grade 2-3 class. And I asked them, what do you bring with you on a boating trip? So their little hands went up, and I asked the first kid, and he said, a gun. So a gun is not on Transport Canada's pre-departure checklist. But even the littlest members of this community knew that if you were going out on the land, you're an idiot if you didn't bring a rifle with you. You needed a rifle in case a bear came after you, in case you got stuck and needed to hunt, in case you needed to get people's attention. There were all sorts of uses for it. And I was like, sorry, no, not on the list. And I said, who else has an idea? And the next little kid who put up his hand, this is a true story, said, well, before we go out on the water, we say a prayer. So this was a Dene community, and in Dene culture, it is very important to recognize the power that the water has, not only to give life, but to take life. So before you go on it or take something out of it, you give it an offering. So sometimes it's tobacco, a piece of clothing, some money. But again, this isn't on the pre-departure checklist. And so it really got me to thinking, who gets to decide what is on this list and what matters? Because one of the things that's on the list is lights. So if you know the Arctic, you know that in the summer, it's 24 hours of daylight. So lights are really, pretty useless, but they're mandated. So Transport Canada is saying you have to have lights, which are completely useless to Northerners, but they say nothing about, for instance, taking a rifle and ammunition with you. So we really see just the ways in which Northern realities are completely ignored. And so if I'm telling kids what's important, well, make sure, you've got your port light and you've got your starboard light. It's really hard to take me seriously because it just doesn't seem very important. Another thing that I found was that aquatic leadership training is deeply problematic and that there is a lot of institutionalized racism. So I had a fantastic student who spent a summer working at both a waterfront and a pool in a northern community. And this community is interesting because there is a reserve that's about a half-hour drive away, and then there's the town. And the town has a pool, and the reserve has a waterfront. And what we're finding is that very few of the Indigenous kids from the reserve, the First Nations kids from the reserve, will go into town to use the pool. And they found that when they went to the pool, there was like this hypervigilance, that they were expected to behave badly. And so the lifeguards were really hard on them and, criticizing them and just assuming that they were going to be bad kids. And so that's where the pool was, where a lot of the aquatics training happened, right? So they had like the highly certified lifeguards. But the Indigenous kids who would swim on reserve wouldn't go to the pool to take the training. And so then you'd have to have non-Indigenous people coming into the Indigenous community to run the waterfront, right? So it was really this feeling that they were not welcome at the pool, that they were not treated fairly. And we see this a lot through aquatics training as well. When we think about what a lifeguard does, it's very much command and control, right? Like you tell people when they're doing something wrong, you tell them what to do, what to do right, and you're strict. Eye contact is a big thing too, right? Well, if you're from an Indigenous community, like a Cree community, you don't make eye contact with somebody that you respect, right? It's in general, and of course, I should not speak for all Cree communities here, but what I've been told when I worked for Big Stone Cree First Nation was that you don't make eye contact with someone who's an elder. It's a sign of respect to avert your eyes. You are certainly not going to yell at people and tell them what to do. Yet this is, we have this lifeguard presence as being very authoritative. So there's not really a lot of room for different forms of leadership. So institutionalized racism is something that we need to think about. I've seen kids who failed courses because they weren't loud enough, right? Well, is it, because they weren't assertive enough? We have to say, is this really what is necessary all the time? And then another thing that I found was the assumption that wearing a life jacket is viewed as feminine behavior or as white behavior. So people have told me, because I've done a lot of work saying, why don't you wear life jackets? They said, if they wore a life jacket, the person driving the boat would be offended and think that they didn't know what they were doing. Also, that if they were wearing a life jacket, it would mean that, they couldn't swim, that it was like sissy behavior, label all sorts of other, derogatory terms about women's anatomy that is used to, convey displeasure to men. And so when we're telling people, well, just wear a life jacket, we're maybe not thinking about the connotations that might have for people, right? And it's easy just to think about life jacket, well, don't be silly. This is just a safety device. Well, culturally, that wasn't done in the past. I've had people say to me, do you think my ancestors wore life jackets? No, right? Like my ancestors survived since time immemorial and they didn't wear life jackets. And I mean, you have to admit that there is some logic to it and that there are other safety mechanisms that people in the North have used. So for instance, sealskin clothing can have flotation properties to it. Same thing with caribou skin clothing. So it was basically, the original floater suit was wearing traditional materials. Of course, there are changes to context now, right? Like big motors didn't exist in the past. People were maybe wearing more traditional clothing than now. But again, we have to think about the ways in which there are colonial connotations of telling people what to wear and how to live their lives. And I think sometimes we forget that. We're like, oh, it's just safety. It's just safety information that I'm conveying. I'm telling them how to be safe. Well, no, you're yet another person who is not from their community telling them what they should or should not do. So there's a very loaded colonial history there that we need to consider. So one of the things that I like to stress is that we're not born with expiry dates, and that the social determinants of health have a really big impact on how long we live. It's almost taken for granted that men die before women, that men just have shorter life expectancies. But again, we're not born with the best before date. These are because of the actions that we do or do not take in our lives that's based on the factors that determine your health status. So things like gender, ethnicity, employment, education. And Charlotte Lopi-Redding, well, now just Charlotte Lopi, and Ross Wine looked at the Aboriginal social determinants of health. And their argument, which I think is very compelling, is that they are not the same for Indigenous peoples in Canada as they are for non-Indigenous peoples in Canada. And a lot of that has to do with differential experiences, with a lack of cultural continuity, with being exposed to colonialism, and to having limitations put on their self-determination. So I want to layer that kind of colonialism on top of masculinity for a second. And I think this billboard is kind of brilliant. This year, thousands of men will die from stubbornness. No, we won't. We know that there's something going on with masculinity and drowning when we look at the really high rates of drowning amongst men compared to women. So let's just dig into masculinity, risk, and injury for a second. So Flynn et al. Found that in general, men tend to judge risks as smaller and less problematic than do women. And Burns et al. Did a meta-analysis of 150 studies. So that's basically, you're looking at the results of 150 studies trying to find commonalities. And they found that males are more likely to take risks than females, but it varies by age and context. And certainly, the age, so 15 to 54, and the context, aquatics, seems to be a pretty rich environment for men taking risks. And I found this fascinating, that men and boys take more risks even when it's clear that it's a bad idea to take a risk. Okay, that is somewhat stunning, right? Knowing that bad things can happen, but doing it anyway. I mean, I think we really have to realize that, again, if we give the same program to men and women, it could have very different results because they could take up the information in different ways. Now, on the contrary side, girls and women are disinclined to take risks, even in fairly innocuous situations or when it might be a good idea to take a risk. And a lot of this work has looked at intellectual risk taking. So applying for a job that you might not be fully qualified for, applying to get into a college or university that is hard to do. Girls and women are less likely to do that. So again, age and circumstance has a big role to play, but in general, we know that men are making riskier choices. Now, certainly these riskier choices could be linked to bio or neurological issues. There's an argument to be made for that. As someone who's a social scientist, however, I think it has a lot to do with culture and society. And if we look at injury prevention, it tends to be, very heterosexist and I would say homophobic. So I just finished a study on this that was just kind of, it's going through the process at Health Promotion Journal of Australia right now, where we looked at ads about men and drowning prevention. And all of them were about men staying safe so that they live to help their family. Or it's like the men wearing a life jacket and saying, I wear my life jacket because I want to be around for my family. In Australia, they have a campaign called Wrap Dad in a Life Jacket, which is the idea of giving dad a life jacket for Father's Day. So all of these things really depend on men being in relationships where they have children. And all of them are depicted as being in heterosexual relationships too. So I think we also need to realize that men are valuable whether or not they're fathers, and we need to change some of the messaging around that. We know that the behaviors that make men, quote unquote, men, increase the risk of injury and death and put others at risk too. So, people say, don't be insert a terrible word for women, drive faster, you don't have to wear a life jacket, things like that. Men often goad other men into taking risks. But here's the thing, is that men are more concerned about their health than they think that other men are concerned about their health. So they think, oh, I'm kind of worried about my health, but he doesn't seem worried about his, so I'm just going to step up my risk, not realizing that that other person is actually worried too, but doesn't want him to know. We also know that men who subscribe to dominant norms of masculine behavior have poorer health-related behaviors than those who don't. So men who see themselves as being very masculine, kind of hyper-heterosexual, all of these things have a lot to do with it. So we need to consider, when we tell men to wear life jackets, the ways in which that is heavily gendered, and also that there's a cultural component to it as well. So there's intersections there, right? And then we layer on colonialism to this as well. So back to the idea of the best before date. If we look at non-Indigenous men and women in Canada, we can see life expectancy for women, 84, men is 80. There are three groups of Indigenous peoples in Canada. So for Métis men, it's 5.1 years lower. Métis women, 5.4. First Nations men, that would be Native Americans in American parlance, 6.1. First Nations female, 5.4. Inuit men, 14.4 years lower. And Inuit female, 10.5 years lower. I mean, this is enormous. Yet it seems to be, again, accepted as fact. Oh, these populations just don't live as long. But we fail to account for the factors that play roles in this. And injury is a major contributor to years of life lost. So these data are a bit old, and they're only for First Nations people, but I think it shows something that's really stunning. And that's that injury and poisoning is basically, almost off the charts as a cause of years of life lost. So it's basically how many years of life you're not going to live because you died when compared to the rest of Canada. And certainly injury also involves self-injury, so suicide. And we know that there's a huge problem with suicide amongst Indigenous peoples in Canada. But injury is often ignored, right? Like, it's not nearly as sexy as, raising money for cancer, looking at, infectious diseases. So within healthcare, public health is often neglected. And I think we can see this as COVID has happened and how ill-prepared certain countries were. But even within public health, injury prevention is neglected too. Yet we can see that it's a huge factor in years of life lost. So we need to remember that the results of colonialism is that it undermines the intermediate behaviors, the intermediate determinants of health, and is also undermined by the distal determinants of health. And the legacy of colonialism is in the Indian Act, which banned cultural practices, tried to assimilate Indigenous peoples into Canadian mainstream society, and it also resulted in the chronic underfunding of education and health. So what people may not know about Canada is that health is a provincial or territorial jurisdiction unless you're an Indigenous person, in which case it's a federal matter. The only other people for whom it's a federal matter are people who are incarcerated and people who are in the armed forces. And then same thing with education. Education, again, is provincial or territorial unless it's on reserve, in which case it's a federal matter. And what we find with schooling, for instance, is that schools on reserve get about 50% of the funding that their provincial counterparts that can be just across the road get, right? So when you underfund education and when you underfund healthcare, this has huge outcomes in terms of injury. So health communication strategies. So there are 5 approaches to health communication strategies. And what I really want to stress is that knowing what we know about masculinity, indigeneity, colonialism, there are 2 that we really should engage with. So one is called a sociocultural strategy. So that's when you have an in-depth understanding of culturally normative practices and beliefs shared by members of the targeted group. I think the best way to achieve that is by engaging in the next approach, which is constituent involving health communication, which is where you have a collaboration of target group members in the process of program and material development. And certainly that example that I gave you with the float coat from Alaska speaks to the ways in which it can be very effective. So I think knowing what we now know, we need to reframe Aboriginal health. The dominant understanding of Indigenous health in Canada is that Indigenous people have the worst health on basically every measure, and that medical portrayals of Indigenous people paint them as basically being pathetic, pathological, and powerless, as Mary Ellen Kelm has said. There's this narrative that Indigenous people fail to engage with safety by not wearing life jackets. They live a dangerous lifestyle in dangerous locations. But all of this is really characteristic of the neoliberal focus on the individual. And it ignores the policies and practices that have produced these factors, as well as resistance to these narratives. So if we want to reframe and decolonize Indigenous health in terms of water-related injury, I think we need to consider drowning as a material consequence of colonial relations of power and masculinity, and that we need to address larger underlying relations of power. So this picture at the top, I love. So this is Taloyuak Nunavut. And one of my students, she spent 4 summers actually running the pool in that community. And what she found was that the pool, kept bringing her up from the south to share her knowledge. But there was no role at the pool for elders to transmit their knowledge, despite the fact that they were the ones who culturally should be sharing information. So what she did was she invited the elders from the nursing home to come to the pool. So here you can see 6 of them in the pool for the first time. And they said, this is great. Now we can teach our grandchildren about this. So trying to be like saying, as somebody who is non-Indigenous and from the South, I am not going to be the best person to transmit these ideas, this knowledge. Who would be great? Elders who are respected and knowledgeable and speak the language. So bringing them into the pool, right? Which I think we very rarely do. We don't think about the pool as being a place for people who are not certified. But how do people who are not certified in kind of Western ways, how could they bring their knowledge to the pool? So bringing experienced hunters in, for instance, people who are really experienced boaters could be revolutionary. I think it's also great for the pool to be seen as a place where all community members are invited and valued. The picture at the bottom, I also love. So I mentioned that a lot of the pools are only 3 feet deep. And so the joke for the longest time was, we don't need somebody with a lifeguarding qualification, we need somebody who's 4 feet tall. And then I kind of thought, what if we really take that to heart? So part of the problem was that in these communities, all these kids grew up with this shallow water pool. But then if they wanted to become lifeguards, they had to go to the big city and do the lifeguarding courses, but they didn't have the deep water skills. So we said, what if we work with the Life Saving Society to develop a shallow water pool lifeguard certification? And people don't actually need to know how to swim. They just need to know how to do, the scanning, the spinal rollovers, the first aid components. And the people in this picture, they're all Indigenous youth who we trained and they became certified as shallow water pool lifeguards. So rather than having to fly the equivalent of 20-year-old Audrey into the community, they could now hire their own 20-year-old youth who are in the community too, who know the kids, who know the culture, who know the context, and are going to be much better situated to share this knowledge. So, we need to align policy with people's kind of lived experience and saying, it's great to have these public health policies that say you have to have these lifeguarding qualifications, but if they're not truly necessary, how can we disrupt that? And that was a huge process because we actually had to change the Public Health Act for the Northwest Territories, but it was one of the kind of the most exciting things that I've done in my career. Again, taking a community-based approach is really important, as I think the float coat study shows. And I think that if we do all of these things that we can do, in Zebedee Nungak's words, constructive damage to the status quo. So over the years, I've had a lot of help from many fantastic students, and here are some of them who have worked on these projects with me. And I'm going to end it there, and I'm happy to take your questions.
Wonderful. That's amazing. Thank you so much, Dr. Giles. I'm going to make a couple comments and then start us off with one question. So that gives everyone the chance to pop your questions in the chat box. Please, I do want to engage your questions and not just make it about me. So now's your chance to type those up. Loved a lot of the things that you shared, especially, that coroner reporting does not report ethnicity is just mind-blowing to me. How can we guesstimate somebody's ethnicity based on a name? I mean, that has so many implications for other areas as well. Childhood lessons are not getting through, like childhood-based water safety lessons are not getting that uptake into adults, as you said. Learning to swim may not be the issue. Different specialized data, how can we adjust it for different cultural sensitivity, cultural awareness? So my first question would be, so we have a lot of aquatic managers, programmers, people who run facilities in, let's say, urban areas in southern Canada, as you said, in the United States. We're not right in the north, but we want to do better. In your experience, where would you say like simple strategies to start? Because we can't throw out those programs. We might have big financial contracts with Red Cross or Life Saving. Where do we start in adapting, like you said, making them appropriate or recognizing the limitations?
I mean, I think what I would do is trying to develop an advisory group, right? So getting people who are from the community, who are interested, and ask and say, we really want to make sure that this facility is welcoming to everybody. What can we do? I'm a big believer that people also need to be compensated for their expertise, because apparently, often Indigenous peoples are asked to volunteer in lots of really important capacities that should be paid. So seeing if there can be some funding dedicated towards that, I think is really important. Offering childcare is also really important if you want people to come. And food brings everybody together. So I'm always a big fan of snacks, especially in the northern communities where I work, where food is so expensive. So I think that's one of the most important things. And maybe reaching out to there might be a local friendship center if you're in a city in Canada that could help. Or talking to, regional Indigenous representatives too. So I think that would be my starting point.
Absolutely. And I have to recognize for both of us that, you can't speak to every community and every location. It's going to be different in each location. Like everybody's going to have to put in the work to figure out what's appropriate for their location. Let's talk implementation. So let's say you have a meeting, you get these great ideas, then you go back to management and say, the data shows that we need to spend more time educating adults, or we need to change your advocacy and outreach. You mentioned the pushback on that. What has worked in your experience to kind of
family events? Yeah, family events are a great way to get parents into the pool. So I've been doing quite a bit of work with people in Alaska with their Kids Don't Float program. And they have amazing resources. I'd encourage everyone to look at the Alaska boating safety resources online. And one of the things that they found was taking a family-based approach was really important. And particularly in the boating context, if something happens to you, what are your kids going to do in the middle of a lake in a boat, right? And I think there's some really powerful messages that we can instill in people about the importance of parents wearing life jackets. We all see boats where it's the kids or the kids and the women wearing life jackets and the driver, who is typically the man, not. And okay, great, but what happens if something happens to that man? How do your kids get to help? There's a film called Cold Water Survivors. It's on YouTube. It's 14 minutes long. It's put out by, again, the Alaskans. It won like an Emmy for a public service announcement. There we go. Yeah. I think it's a really powerful film, and it's about, two girls who survived while their father and friend drowned in a boating incident.
Yeah. We'll find that on YouTube. We'll link it in the show notes. I have to second what you've been saying about the cultural connection to recovering bodies as a major motivating perspective that I didn't have coming from suburban Ontario. So to make a long story short, I've been following Bruce's legacy, which is a nonprofit in the US that he travels the country, and he was up in Canada last year doing a recovery in Lake Minnewanka, which is one of the deepest lakes in Canada. And the family of this individual has been expending months and tons of money to find the body, and it's been really it's prolonging the grief for them. And I think it's something that in certain contexts is appropriate to really leverage as a discussion piece. Maybe it's those 20-something males that, like you mentioned, that men have different understandings of their own risk and danger, and really saying, well, do you want your parents to have to come look for your body, is a different tactic that maybe might work more effectively. One of the other things I thought of as you were talking, and again, I want to remind people, if you have any chance for questions, please pop those in as soon as possible so we can get to them and let Dr. Giles go. But even just reorienting water temperature in our discussions of water safety. So if I'm teaching in Calgary in June, I'm thinking warmish water, but if I have people in remote areas, that water temperature, cold water safety should be a concern all year round, right, in our teaching.
Yeah, but people have a lot of misconceptions about cold water too. One of the things that I've really had to deal with in the north, and one of the things I'm working on right now is we're revising the cold water survival program that Dr. Gordon Giesbrecht, so Professor Popsicle, has put together, is that people in the north believe that if you fall into the water, it's so cold you're going to die right away. Not realizing the role that life jackets play in keeping you alive, because it's keeping that airway open and giving you the chance to do things for survival, and that you're going to survive at least half an hour, basically, no matter how cold the water is. And people really having no idea that was the case. And when we've taught that course and some others, that's been one of the big takeaway messages, that people are like, I had no idea I could survive that long. So I understand why I want to wear a life jacket now, because if I'm going to survive, I can use that time for self-rescue.
And to acclimate and regain your senses, and then make a move, as you said, either with the knife to get out on the ice, or the basic ice safety that we do teach in programs. I wanted to talk a little bit about elders, and I think there's applications in other communities as well, whether there's cultural leaders or religious group leaders in the area, and how in pools can we better integrate those people in our pool programs. I guess you mentioned the lifeguards or the shallow water attendants. Have there been any other successful programs you've seen in bringing in elders to the pool? No,
to be honest, no, I haven't.
Okay.
And I think that's a lot of that is based on, especially in the north, it tends to be, it's a seasonal job. You get people up for one summer and then they don't come back, right? Yeah. So I think that there's not that opportunity often to build those relationships and to have those people come in. So I think if we can teach people, resensitize people to that before they go, it would be really important.
And to give context for our Americans, the Northern Water Program Dr. Giles has been mentioning, at least when I was in Toronto, it was very much kind of a flyer, go live in the North, have this experience. And although it was great for somebody to go and learn, for the community, there was very little continuity, because it could be any person, any year, in any location. And there was limited training provided and community integration for some people to really provide that ongoing networking and development. So I see one question from Sarah, and I think that'll be it, unless there's any other questions. Are there specific steps recognizing that there are differences between cohorts that we could take when creating programs for groups at higher risk? What are most aquatic safety programs, why are most programs that currently exist child-focused when they're not the highest risk group?
Yeah, I mean, children are at high risk. So the stats I pulled were mostly boating related. So children are at high risk for falling into backyard pools, drowning in tubs, things like that, right? So they're not. I think they're vulnerable in a different way, right? They're vulnerable because they can't help themselves. Adults are vulnerable in a different way because we make poor decisions often, or we make decisions within a very limited scope of what's available to us. So I think what's important is recognizing that everyone plays a role. It's interesting that some of the men I've talked to have been like, my wife plays a role because she tells me to wear my life jacket because she cares about me, right? Yeah. So it's interesting to again, I think it's interesting to put that on women. But I think women do have a role to play, saying I want you to come home, going to wear a life jacket. People do wear them to be good role models for their kids. So I know several people who, once they had kids, they started wearing their life jackets. I'll be interested to see what happens when those kids become teenagers, though, or if that behavior changes, right? So I think I think part of it is talking about it, saying these are the statistics, and looking at the ways that men also egg other men on to make poor decisions, right? Mm-hmm. Like jumping from a cliff. Cliff jumping, riding fast, taking risks. And I really think a lot of that is tied up with, masculinity, and particularly being like, don't be a wuss. What's wrong with you? If you're a real man, just putting people down, and just really trying to think about some of the outcomes of that. We see this with hazing, right? Like a young man just died in the States. I was reading yesterday from, fraternity hazing. We see this, and I think men have a huge role to play in encouraging other men to make better choices.
Well, and it's interesting, just as you were saying that, I was thinking all the times that I scheduled staff for water safety events, I never made it gendered in my mind, and maybe it would have been more appropriate to have mostly male lifeguards, depending on who I anticipated the audience being or the demographic that we were trying to reach, right? Because we tend to have a lot of female staff, and
Absolutely.
if there's individuals in the community that represent the audience that we're trying to reach, how can we strategize and ask them or work with them to say, hey, what's going to connect with the people we're trying to reaching who are most at risk?
Yeah, and I know Edmonton, for a while, they had a pilot program where they were trying to train Indigenous peoples to work at pools. And I think that's so important, right? Getting people who look like you, who have your life experiences, working at these facilities. It's probably the best thing you can do.
And having those role models as well that our youth can aspire to and realize that it is accessible. It may not be easy. It may be impediments that we as programmers and managers, we have to overcome and make accommodations or make allowances and understand, but that it should be achievable for anybody. All right, let's thank you so much, Dr. Giles. We will let you go. Just make sure that you exit without ending. And right. I want to say thank you so much for joining us today. I know you've given us a lot to think about, and I know a lot of people will have long kind of action lists. Dr. Giles' presentation is available on the show notes. You can have a look at the slides there. You can find her academic profile is linked as well, so you can find her contact information. She's written many peer-reviewed articles. So that's a very long rabbit trail if you start reading those. But thank you so much for your time today.
Well, I really want to thank you for inviting me. And I love this effort that you're making to build community, to share knowledge. And I think that is really revolutionary within water safety. So thank you. And for all of you who attended, I think that's really great that you're all there. Just like, I have goosebumps. I'm like, we're all geeking out over water safety, and how amazing is that? Yeah.
Well, and that's the best thing is we don't have to go to a conference with all of the reccees. We can just bring in the pool people and do exactly what we...
Exactly. Yeah. And if anyone has any questions, I'm always happy to chat.
All right. Thanks everyone for joining us today. I'm going to do a little bit of a recap if you have a few minutes, let you know what's coming up. Somebody is asking about the Alaska video. So if we scroll back up, I'm going to pin that in the chat box. I will also make sure that it is on the show notes. Thank you so much to Sarah for finding that. I've now pinned the Alaska video, and I'll make sure it gets on the show notes. So thank you so much for joining us today. It was a little bit, we were time conscious because she is a full professor, very active, and I'm so grateful that she was able to donate her time today. So I know a lot of people that you're going to be mulling it over in your head and a lot of things to consider. So definitely download those PowerPoint slides, reach out to her. She's very quick on email. She's very happy to chat on the phone. She's prolific on Twitter. If you want to follow Dr. Giles on Twitter, I didn't link to that, but you can find her very easily on Twitter. She is a tremendous advocate, both within water safety as well as with our, trying to remember now, she said Indigenous is preferred, our Indigenous communities. So what's coming up the rest of this week? So today is Wednesday, March 10th. We've finished this webinar. Coming up on Friday, we are going to have a session regarding focusing recreation efforts on seniors. So this is going to be from two occupational therapists, They do not have an aquatic specific background, but I think it's vital that they bring us perspective on how to center our recreation programming in pools on the people that are using it. So we have a tendency to say, this is what people need, this is what we're programming, we know the audience. But if you think about something like aquatic fitness, aqua fitness classes, they're usually either high intensity, low intensity, there's not anything in between. How are we reaching people with different mobility challenges, maybe different rehabilitation limitations? And so they're going to be talking about how their work in seniors communities in Regina, Saskatchewan, how it applies to those of us who are programming and thinking about our aquatic programs. It's not just about aquatic fitness. So really excited about that session coming up on Friday with Shauna and Alicia. I can also let you know that we will have another prize coming up on Friday. So if you're able to attend live, there is a prize pack on Friday. Also on Monday, March 15th, we have a session about more the operational and mechanical side of things. But for those of you involved in projects, whether it's renovations, new pools, we're going to be hearing from Jamie Lopes, who is an engineer of aquatic facilities. So he maps out all of the blueprints for pools to be built or renovated, whether they're, it's an RFP, like request for proposal, the scope for a new construction. He only does pools, and he's based out of Waterloo, Ontario. He's also a certified pool operator instructor like me. So he's going to be taking a high level look at who's responsible in the construction of a pool or renovation. What does the engineer do? What does the architect do? What does the project manager do? What are the different work areas like plumbing or HVAC? It's going to be a really good general intro for those of you who kind of sometimes don't know what's going on. I can also let you know on Monday, we have a phenomenal set of prizes donated by Water ID in Germany. So they have donated test kits. This is your sneak peek. It will not be on social media, but they have donated 3 full test kits, $450 value each. They're not sponsoring the episode. They're just providing prizes. This is a product I love. So if you want a chance to win, you do need to be live on Monday for that session. We'll be giving away 3 water test kits to participants anywhere in the world. So that is super, super exciting. Wednesday next week, we have our own Joshua Koch from Strathcona County in Alberta. He's going to be talking customer service. And if you've heard Josh before, he is hilarious. He is going to be taking some of the ideas that many of us know from brands such as Starbucks, Disney, giving some good customer service strategies. And I know you're thinking it's COVID. This is not something I'm worried about, but this will hopefully be a good foundational session for those of you who maybe don't have good background in customer service or are looking to streamline what you do with your staff. And so it's a good opportunity to come out, hear what he's talking about, and then maybe when the recording's available, add it to your playlist on YouTube, save it, send it out to your staff, or see how you can integrate it in your facility. So that's kind of what we have planned over the next week. I want to say thank you so much to those of you who are here today. If you do have any questions, I'm going to be in the chat box for a few minutes. Really appreciate your support, and thank you for coming out live. I know there are a lot of competing things going on right now with pools reopening, limits being lifted in different states and provinces preparing to reopen. So if we can do anything to support you, please don't hesitate to contact me. Most of you know Lakeview Aquatic Consultants. We're on Facebook, we're on Instagram. We have all of the recordings of the 2020 webinars on YouTube. So let me post some of those links in the chat box. We have a monthly newsletter. So if there's any way we can help you, please don't hesitate to reach out to me. Pop those in the chat box. And if you're interested, we do still have a few mugs remaining. I don't have many left. I think I have 6 or 7. But if you are interested in the mugs or the patches, these are to support the webinars, which are 100% free. They're not sponsored. All of our presenters, like Dr. Giles, have donated their time. They're not being compensated. So if you have any desire to buy any of these items, they are available on our website. And I will pop that link in the chat box as well. Yeah. So thank you so much, everyone. Appreciate your feedback. Have a great rest of the day. Unfortunately, it's flurries here outside Calgary, so fingers crossed it's not going to lay. Thanks so much, Sarah, for your help with finding that video. I'm going to make sure it's on the playlist later, and I'll update with any other resources that we share or find that are relevant to today's session. So thanks so much, everyone.